Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And yeah, I really appreciate you being with me, and I appreciate being with you. I want to jump right back into our discussion. Now, remember, we've been spending a good bit of time demonstrating that the coming of the Lord to bring in the new creation of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, is the coming of the Lord to bring in the new creation of Isaiah chapter 65. And that correlation, ladies and gentlemen, becomes definitive proof. Number one, the Olivet Discourse cannot be divided into two different subjects. Number two, as a result of that, it proves that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following has nothing to do with the so-called end of time. Point number three, it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that whatever our concept of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following might be, it has to be focused on the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Pardon me. If it is true that the coming of the Lord of Isaiah 64 to 66, but Isaiah 65, to bring in the new creation, is the day of the Lord to bring in the new creation of Matthew chapter 25, then since it's true that Isaiah chapter 65 was a promise made to Old Covenant Israel in the Old Testament, obviously, then it must be true that Matthew 25, 31 and following is the anticipation of the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Once again, that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, none of the Olivet Discourse, has anything whatsoever to do with the end of the Christian age. It's not about God's promises made to the church divorced from Israel. It's all about the fulfillment of God's promises to Old Covenant Israel. Now, what was the purpose of that? God's purposes was to deal with Israel, to bring salvation to the nations. And of course, one of the greatest mistakes that exegetes make when they come to Matthew chapter 25, they see it as the harvest of the globe. They see it as the harvest of the entire history of humankind on the globe, and they see it as the end of time. Instead of seeing it as the time of the harvest of the Old Covenant age and the full ushering in of the eternal, unending age of Jesus Christ. And so that failure to place Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following in the proper context, in the proper prophetic, historical, and eschatological context, invariably leads to a wrong interpretation of the Olivet Discourse as a whole, and specifically to Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. Now then, building upon that, for the last couple of videos, I've been sharing with you, I've been focused on the fact that, yes, indeed, Isaiah 65 is the source for Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. And with that being true, okay, there are certain things in Isaiah 65 that absolutely demand that, therefore, Matthew 25, 31 and following was fulfilled in AD 70. One of the most beautiful features of Isaiah chapter 65 is the promise of the Messianic banquet. This beautiful promise, my servant shall eat, you shall be hungry. My servant shall drink, you shall be thirsty. My servant shall sing for joy of heart. You shall wail for sorrow of heart. You will leave your name as a curse to my chosen. For the Lord God will slay you, call his people by a new name. It is this new people, ladies and gentlemen, comprised of the righteous remnant of Old Covenant Israel and the Gentiles that would be privileged and are privileged to eat at the Messianic banquet. This is such a beautiful concept. Now, pardon me. Last week, we went to Isaiah chapter 25. I'm going to try to keep this video somewhat brief. I don't want to do 20 minutes. What I want to do is take a look at Isaiah chapter 25 as it correlates, and it does. It's obviously the same thing. Isaiah chapter 25. Now remember, this is what is known as the little apocalypse from Isaiah 24 all the way through chapter, I think, 28. In that passage, Isaiah 24 through 28, we find the repetition of the prediction of the coming destruction of Jerusalem. Once again, not the end of time, but at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, for instance, in Isaiah chapter 24, the last few verses of that chapter, what do we find? Well, we find the judgment of the wicked, the judgment being shut up in a prison for a long time. I personally have a tendency to correlate that to the millennium. Be that as it may. Following hard upon that is the destruction of the temple and the city, and then chapter 25, 6 and following. Upon this mountain. What mountain, ladies and gentlemen? I've shared with you in the past the absolute critical nature of Zion in the Old Testament Messianic prophecies. Zion, in Messianic prophecy, was to be the locus of the kingdom, the Messianic banquet, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2 and following. It shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house, folks, that's Zion. And that's the promise of the Messianic temple. The mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills. Many people will come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to Jerusalem, to Zion. For the word of the Lord will go forth from Jerusalem to all the nations. So Zion is the locus of the kingdom. Zion is the locus of salvation. Isaiah 46 and verse 13. Behold, I put salvation in Zion. And I'm not going to spend the time to elucidate every single constituent eschatological concept and soteriological concept that is linked with Zion. But look, it is so rich. One of the richest, one of the most important is resurrection. The wedding. Again, the kingdom, but resurrection. In Isaiah 25, 6 and following, I want you to notice how we have the Messianic banquet and resurrection inextricably bound up with each other. And in this mountain, that's Zion, the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of choice pieces, a feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of well-defined wines on the lees. And, see, here's this coordinating conjunction that joins this discussion of the Messianic banquet on Zion, and he will destroy on this mountain. Now look, folks, it's really, really, really common for commentators to say, well, yeah, we are privileged now to sit down with the Lord in the kingdom. And we'll spend some time on Matthew chapter 8, verse 11. Some former preterists claim that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sat down at the Messianic banquet while they were still alive, or at the very least after they died. No, they didn't, unless they were resurrected. And so some of these former preterists, they say, well, you see, the Messianic banquet was established long, long ago. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are currently sitting at the table. Oh, but wait a minute. We're still waiting for the resurrection. Do you see the divorcing, the dichotomization that these individuals are engaging in? Oh, Messianic banquet 2,000 years ago. Resurrection so far 2,000 years later, and we're still waiting on it. So they insert a 2,000-year gap into the "and" at the beginning of verse 8. Oh, and by the way, in so doing, they divorce this promise of the Messianic banquet and this promise of the resurrection from the hope of Israel. As N.T. Wright said, in many, many ways, in different places, the scriptures teach us that whatever it was that God promised and had planned for the nations, he would do it in and through Israel. Well, what that means, ladies and gentlemen, guess what? For God's promises for the nations to be brought through Israel, that means that God's covenant with Israel had to remain valid, because it was God's covenant with Israel to bless the nations. You know, the Abrahamic promise carried through Torah. You cannot separate, ladies and gentlemen, the blessings that God had planned for the nations from Israel. And you cannot separate Israel from God's covenant with her and to say, oh, well, God removed he removed his covenant with Israel. Oh, but wait, we're still waiting for God to bless the nations through Israel. What? You see, it makes no sense whatsoever. So, this brings us up to the point of realizing that whatever Isaiah chapter 25, in regard to the Messianic banquet, in regard to the resurrection, no matter what we might perceive it to be, it had to be fulfilled while Israel remained God's covenant people, which means that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following would only be fulfilled when Israel remained as God's covenant people. Do you see the problems of placing Matthew 25, 31 and following at the so-called end of the endless Christian age? It just doesn't work. Now, I discuss all of this and more in this month's incredibly good two-book offer. The resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, fulfilled our future, and we shall meet him in the air, the wedding of the King of Kings. Both of these books, listen, if you purchase both of these books separately and you paid separate shipping, it costs you almost $58. All right? During the month of May 2023, U.S. orders only, total delivered price $39.95. That's going to save you a real healthy chunk of money. Go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com. There's a wonderful tab right up at the very top. Just click the link place your order, and you'll be glad you did. Okay, more on the Messianic banquet on the flip side.